In this video, I'll be talking about the movie Hereditary. So I'll be making this analysis and summary video with the assumption that interested viewers have already seen the movie. Obviously, spoilers ahead. Now the purpose of this video is to examine Paimon, one of the kings of hell, but I'll also be summarizing the entire movie and pointing out some interesting things that I've found, such as visual clues, foreshadowing, and other things that you might have missed on your first viewing. To do this, I'll have to examine the three main characters in which Paimon inhabits. This is my own subjective reading on the movie, and I really want to hear your thoughts and interpretations, so please leave them in the comments. Now on to the video. In the movie Hereditary, the sense of foreboding doom is ever present, a sense of wrongness in every scene. Immediately, just from the opening sequence, much can be foreshadowed about the horrors to come. There's a lingering shot of a beautiful treehouse that hints at its importance in the story's conclusion. A fly can be seen buzzing away near the window, hinting that corruption is already present in the home. The camera pans around the room, revealing Annie's workroom and all her dioramas. Then there's a mind-bending sequence in which the camera zooms into the diorama of the Graham family house, then into Peter's room, which becomes Peter's actual room. Not only is this a very cool way to begin the movie, it also hints that things are not what they seem. Like a dollhouse or a diorama that is created and manipulated by an artist, the Grahams themselves are not in control of their own lives. A group of manipulators has set the stage, and the family are pawns trapped in a metaphorical dollhouse. Their ultimate fates usurped by a greater will. But who is the master puppeteer? For those who have seen the movie, the most likely suspect is the main antagonist, one of the kings of hell, and one of the main players in this supernatural story, King Paimon. But I'm not quite certain. King Paimon is an enigmatic figure in the story and is undoubtedly a malevolent interloper, but he may not be the true villain behind the curtain. So let's examine Paimon himself. In the beginning of the movie, Paimon is currently inhabiting Charlie, so I'll be examining Charlie and Paimon as a single entity. It really isn't made too clear in the movie how much of Charlie is left, but my reading is that the original Charlie has been suppressed even before her own birth, since it is revealed during Annie's emotional confession that Ellen, Charlie's grandmother, was living with the family when Charlie was born, and that Ellen, not Annie, breastfed Charlie as a baby. This deep attachment between grandmother and granddaughter hints that Paimon had always been within Charlie's body since birth. Ellen, aka Queen Lee, was the cult member of the group who has been attempting to summon Paimon into a suitable male body. So Ellen's deep attachment and fixation on Charlie hints that she was successful. Charlie is an awkward young teen with morbid but artistic hobbies. Charlie also seems to prefer to stay in the treehouse away from the rest of the family, choosing to sleep in the treehouse even when it gets cold. This might hint at Charlie's already supernatural nature, as she may not even feel the cold, because Steve, the father, does comment on how cold it is outside, but Charlie is seen comfortably sleeping without heaters. Later in the movie, Annie too sleeps in the treehouse, and she is seen sleeping with multiple heaters all around her. If Charlie did feel cold, why wouldn't she pull out the heaters? Unless she never felt cold in the first place. Overall, Charlie is quite aloof, but acts quite normal considering the fact that Charlie is Paimon, one of the kings of hell. Charlie gets yelled at by their parents, is shy in public, is fixated on their hobbies, and likes to hide away in their room or treehouse. A pretty typical experience for an introverted teenager. Charlie even misses their recently dead grandmother and whines about wanting her back. This behavior doesn't seem typical of somebody who is a king of hell. So either Charlie and Paimon exist together within one body, with Paimon maybe lurking in the background, or Paimon is in full control but is discombobulated and perhaps does not remember themselves as King Paimon. but only remembering themselves as Charlie, with the original Charlie long gone since Ellen could have summoned Paimon into a fetus or as a newborn. At Ellen's funeral, Charlie does notice a symbol of the cult on Ellen's necklace during the viewing. Annie is also wearing an identical one as she is performing her eulogy. This symbol will appear numerous times throughout the movie and is a symbol of Paimon. Interestingly, Annie does mention that there are a lot of new faces at her mother's funeral, a hint that there are many of Ellen's cult members amongst the crowd. Charlie does notice one of the cult members, a man who is staring and smiling in delight as he looks upon her. She also sees another cultist rub something onto Ellen's lips as she lies in her coffin. This mystery substance is later used on Annie in the movie. During the eulogy, Charlie draws Annie's face in agony. While Annie is sad while giving her speech, she isn't as distressed as Charlie is depicting. I wonder if this is Charlie using art as a means to interpret emotions. Charlie is quiet and does not seem to communicate very well verbally all that much. So maybe this is how Charlie can connect to Annie, a recognition of pain and sadness. Or Charlie is able to see much more of Annie's struggle with Ellen's death. On the flip side, this could also be Charlie just mocking Annie, depicting her in such an overly dramatic and cartoonish way. As Charlie draws, she makes these loud clicking sounds with her tongue. Charlie seems to do this sporadically and unconsciously. This sound is interesting and becomes an idiosyncratic way that seems to signal Paimon's presence. Later that night, Charlie is tucked into bed by Annie, and the two seem to struggle with connecting to one another verbally and physically, with Charlie being quite withdrawn. Annie, for her part, does try to connect with Charlie, reminiscing on Charlie's birth and how attached Ellen was to Charlie and how Charlie was always Ellen's favorite. A few things of note are mentioned, like how Charlie never cried as a child, not even when being born, and how Ellen always fed Charlie, not allowing Annie to feed her. Charlie mentions that Ellen wanted her to be a boy, which at first seems like an innocuous statement, but is actually a major plot point that drives the story, but we'll go into more depth on that topic later in the video. Charlie expresses her concern about who would now take care of her, which Annie tries to reassure her that she will and tries to lighten the mood. But a somber Charlie asks, "But when you die?" This again seems to be a foreshadow of the story, but also hints at Charlie's juvenile behavior. Charlie does seem genuinely upset about Ellen's death, even making drawings of Ellen in her coffin. Annie is really trying to comfort her. This really hints that they may not have the best relationship, but there is affection and care in the family. Annie notices the word sanity written on Charlie's wall near the bed. More words will mysteriously appear as the story unfolds, but this is the first of the mysterious words to be written on a family member's wall. In school, Charlie is once again fixated with her art. Instead of working on her quiz, Charlie is assembling a figurine with what appears to be trash. Her teacher gently nudges her to work on her quiz. A pigeon crashes into a window nearby, startling the children, but Charlie seems eerily calm. She doesn't even look towards the window, only to a pair of scissors, already planning to use it to obtain a new material for her figurine. Later, she calmly takes these scissors and uses it to cut off the pigeon's head while eating a chocolate bar. Charlie collects the head and hides it in the pocket of her hoodie. Across the street, Charlie sees a woman who waves at her, another cult member who has been surveilling her. Back at home, Charlie is working on creating more figures out of trash. As Charlie works, she eats what appears to be M&Ms, which is very interesting since she is highly allergic to nuts. M&Ms are usually not recommended for those with nut allergies, even when it's the milk chocolate variety, since the manufacturing factories usually also process nuts, so this is pretty dangerous. While Charlie is young, I can't imagine that she would not have been warned about the dangers of eating such snacks, again showing a carelessness or a detachment from reality. which Charlie is often doing during social situations. A strange light catches Charlie's attention, and it leads her to look outside. Curious about the light, Charlie wanders outside, past the treehouse, while holding and toying with the pigeon's head, showing that she is completely unbothered by its head. The head is simply material for her art, a necessary piece to finish her figure. This is another huge foreshadow of things to come. Obviously, the infamous car beheading scene, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I interpret Charlie's fixation on creating these figurines as a result of Paimon's desire for a perfect human host. These figurines are humanoid dolls, and Charlie works diligently to create better versions of this ideal body, this time escalating to using a biological head in the form of a decapitated pigeon. An image of this pigeon's head is also depicted as a drawing by Charlie, showing that the pigeon head was a bit of a fixation for her. As Charlie follows the light outside, we see a clear shot of the treehouse. There is an interesting symbol seen on the treehouse built into its structure. This seems to be the Alges rune, part of the Elder Futhark. A very brief summary is that these were used as part of a runic alphabet by ancient Germanic people. I am no expert on ancient runes or what they mean, so if somebody who is more knowledgeable can leave some insight in the comment section, that would be greatly appreciated. But from my cursory glance and research on Wikipedia, more modern interpretations and uses of the Alges rune is as a rune of protection. During the Nazi regime, and specifically with Nazi occultism, the Alges was used to signify life and birth, and an inverted upside-down Alges came to symbolize death. This death rune is called the Todes rune. So these symbols were used to note birth dates and also death dates. So interesting connections of life, death, protection, and occultism, which makes it a perfect symbol for this treehouse. As the camera does an aerial shot, there are visible footprints in the dirt. Charlie follows these footprints that leads to a clearing. Charlie sees an old woman sitting in the field in the distance. She's wearing white and is surrounded by flames. This appears to be Ellen, which has many interesting creepy implications, since pretty early on, the family gets a call about Ellen's body being stolen from the cemetery. Charlie sees Ellen in a white nightgown, and later in the movie, Ellen's headless corpse would also be seen again in the same nightgown, hidden in the attic. So it appears that Ellen's corpse has been hiding in the attic throughout the whole movie, and might have been walking around or moved by other cult members. Charlie is entranced by the sight of Ellen surrounded by fire, but Annie interrupts Charlie and lectures her on wandering outside without her shoes and coat. Annie does not notice Ellen and the ring of fire, so perhaps this is a vision, or Annie simply cannot see the strange tableau, hinting that there is a cloaking spell or something supernatural occurring. This also happens to Peter later in the movie. Annie wrangles Charlie back into the house, again showing that Charlie seems incapable of taking care of herself. She's reckless or just lacks the ability to do so. Perhaps this is a direct result of Ellen's overbearing mothering, which leads back to how Charlie was concerned that no one else would be able to take care of her after Ellen's death. Charlie in many ways behaves more like a very young child, not really a 13-year-old teenager. I also theorize that Charlie aging out of childhood is a huge reason of why things might be happening now. I think what Charlie saw in the field is her grandmother summoning Paimon. More clues as to why I'm pretty sure this is Ellen is by the editing. Right after the light leads Charlie to the window, there's a shot of Ellen holding Charlie as a baby. In a separate scene, Annie does see an apparition of Ellen in the dark in Ellen's room. This makes me believe that Ellen's spirit is still very much present, and that she is the major force behind the figurative curtain. Charlie is called by Ellen to go outside by the weird lights and sees the summoning circle, which also leads Annie to getting upset with Charlie for not wearing her shoes and coat outside. hinting once again that Charlie does not get cold, but the timing of all this is also perfect. Peter had just asked Annie if he can go to a barbecue, trying to frame it as an innocent get-together. But of course he's going to a house party. Annie, assuming that it is a normal barbecue, asks Peter if he would ask Charlie if she would want to go with him. Now, notably, Charlie does not want to go, but Annie makes her go, in the hopes that perhaps Charlie could mingle with other kids her age. What I find fascinating here is that if Charlie/Paimon does not want to go to the party, it means that Paimon was unaware of the cult's activities and can be seen almost as an unwilling participant in all of this. The siblings quietly sit in the car ride together to the house party. As they are passing a wooden electric pole, the symbol of Paimon can be seen carved into the pole, a powerful symbol that would be instrumental in the next step. At the party, an out-of-place and timid Charlie is anxious about being left alone. To calm her and distract her, Peter suggests she have some chocolate cake. Neither Charlie or Peter were aware that nuts were being prepared in the same kitchen. The nuts could have been used in the cake, or it could have been a cross-contamination because the same knife was used when preparing the nuts and the cake. It doesn't take long until Charlie begins to have an allergic reaction. An alarmed Peter immediately jumps into action and tries to take Charlie to the hospital. Peter speeds down the road as Charlie's condition escalates, with her airways almost being completely closed. Struggling to breathe, Charlie leans out the window in a panicked response for more air. As they come closer to the electric pole, a dead deer laying in the road is seen by Peter. He swerves to avoid the collision, but swings the car far off right, putting Charlie's head right into the trajectory of the pole. Going around 70 to 80 miles an hour, Charlie is completely decapitated. A stunned Peter goes into complete shock. In a stupor, he manages to drive home and gets into bed, unable to cope with the recent events. He tells no one of what happened, leaving the horrific sight of Charlie's decapitated body for Annie to discover the following morning. The death of Charlie here is by design. The cult members have obviously used their powers to orchestrate Charlie's beheading. Obvious signs of their machinations includes the strange light, the symbol on the pole, the dead deer, the apparitions of Ellen, the mysterious words on the wall, and the cult members themselves. They wanted Charlie to die, but why? If Charlie is Ellen's favorite and seemingly an important figure in their belief, why would they kill her, and why now? Well, it comes back to Paimon and the search for the ideal male host. I believe that Charlie was selected by Ellen to host Paimon out of necessity, and that this possession was always meant to be temporary. Annie is an artist that makes incredibly detailed miniatures and dioramas. My armchair psychologist's interpretation of this fascination with creating miniatures is Annie's way of coping with the world. As we will come to learn more about Annie, it is painfully clear that Annie has had a very difficult family life. In a scene in which Annie goes to a support group, Annie confides that she was estranged from Ellen when she was pregnant with Peter, but she had allowed her mother back into her life during her second pregnancy with Charlie. This was a huge mistake, as this gave Ellen the opportunity to summon Paimon and use Charlie as a host. This explains the obsessively strong attachment from Ellen to Charlie, even going as far as to breastfeed Charlie as a baby. Ellen is raising her deity, a king of hell, making her Paimon's caretaker and ultimately Queen Mother. Annie and her mother had a very complicated relationship that seemed to be quite antagonistic. Yet Annie can't seem to cut her mother out of her life completely. As mentioned, early she tried, but eventually allowed Ellen back into her life. Even after Ellen's death, Annie does grieve for her, and seems to have had some sort of love for her, though she does ponder why she does not feel more sad after her mother's passing. Annie does make a hospice diorama, which I'm assuming is the hospice in which her mother died, which again shows that she does seem to care about her mother, and is still processing her death. As we see when Annie also makes a diorama of the scene where Charlie was killed. This seems to be a coping mechanism, and in her own words, quote, "a neutral view of the accident." These dioramas are a detached way to deal with loss, to capture the moment in art form. If Annie really didn't care for her mother, she would not have made dioramas of where her mother passed. For Ellen's part, she does also seem to have love for Annie, but Ellen sees their sacrifice as being worth it. In a note that Annie later finds, Ellen writes, quote, "My darling, dear beautiful Annie, forgive me for all the things I could not tell you. Please don't hate me and try not to despair your losses. You will see in the end they were worth it. Our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards. Love, Mommy." So Ellen truly believes that she is justified for all the horrors that she has unleashed upon the family. There's a scene earlier in the movie where Annie finds the door to her mother's room open. She sees a triangle etched into the floor near her mother's bed. The triangle is a powerful and significant symbol in many spiritual and religious beliefs worldwide. But in this case, I'm going to guess that this is some sort of summoning triangle, most likely the very triangle used to summon Paimon into Charlie 13 years prior. We will see more of these summoning triangles later in the movie. So Ellen sees the family as necessary vessels to house Paimon. This has a lot to do with Annie's deceased father and brother, who Annie mentions in the group counseling scene. According to Annie's recollection, her father had died due to self-imposed starvation. Her brother also hanged himself at 16, blaming Ellen for trying to put people inside of him. I believe these were failed attempts of finding suitable male human hosts for Paimon. I believe that Charlie is the third human host in the family, but the first successful one. I think that Charlie was successful because she was so young. There was less opposition by the host to Paimon's incursion. The instability that led to the death of Annie's father and brother was probably due to a battle of wills and control within a single host. So finally, with a suitable, successful host, why kill Charlie now? Well, as I mentioned before, I think this is because Charlie is aging into puberty, and will also soon develop into a young woman, which will be a major incompatibility issue with Paimon. It is hinted in Charlie's conversation with Annie that Ellen had wished for Charlie to be a boy. This is significant because Paimon prefers to be in a male host. This is confirmed in one of the books about the cult's belief that Annie later finds amongst her mother's possessions. Charlie's always seen wearing baggy clothes and hoodies, something that a young boy would feel comfortable in. Even the name Charlie is traditionally a more masculine name. With Charlie now 13 and heading into female puberty, it would be hard for Paimon to exist in a human host that will only continue to become more feminine. So to fix the issue, a permanent male host must be found. An obvious choice, of course, is Peter. But due to the estrangement at the time, Ellen didn't have access to Peter. So Charlie was simply used as a means to an end, her human body used as a convenient vessel, now discarded, her head left on the side of the road to rot, not unlike roadkill. A sad, horrific fate for a young girl. With Charlie dead, Paimon is released. His exact whereabouts are a bit of a mystery. I think now, without a human host, he is most likely existing in some sort of spirit form, perhaps similar to Ellen, who still appears to be lingering. For the next stage, another unwilling host must be offered for Paimon, and the cult has been busy moving pieces into place to trap their new host, the unfortunate Annie. With Charlie dead, Annie is left completely devastated. Her discovery of Charlie's headless body in the car is especially traumatizing. In the aftermath, Annie is doubled over on the floor, writhing in agony. She cries out that she just wants to die after Charlie's funeral. The word Azazaz can now be seen written in Annie's room. This is the second word written on the wall that shows that the cultist is far from done with Annie and the family, also creating implications that the cultist has been in the house, or is still in the house. Charlie's death creates a great rift within the family, with Annie completely withdrawn from her husband and son. She is deeply resentful of Peter and blames him for Charlie's death. Annie also begins to sleep separately from Steve, choosing to sleep in the treehouse as a means to feel close to Charlie. This need to reconnect with Charlie and the isolation from her family is part of the cult's plan. When Annie secretly goes back to her grief counseling group session, a cult member is there to meet her. Joan, another follower of Paimon, and seemingly Ellen's second hand. When Annie decides not to attend the meeting, Joan is the one that chases down the car, catching Annie before she can get away. Joan connects to Annie, presenting herself as a sympathetic person that Annie can confide in. Joan masterfully comforts Annie, while not pushing her too fast or too hard, offering up her own sad story about how her son and grandson drowned a few months ago. Now, there's no way to tell if this is true, but I think that in an insidious way, it has to be true. My theory is that Joan, like Ellen, chose to make a horrible sacrifice, to sacrifice her own grandson and son to make sure that she can ensnare Annie. I'll go into a little more detail of why I think this is the case a little later in the video. Joan writes down her number on a piece of paper and gives it to Annie, so Annie can contact her when Annie is feeling more open to talk. Now, a nice detail is that if you go back to the scene of Annie's therapy session, her group session, you can see Joan sitting off to the right. So Joan has long infiltrated this group and has been keeping an eye on Annie all this time. Later, as Annie tries to work on her diorama, a container of paint spills onto the paper. I watched this scene over and over again, and it is clear that it just falls over without Annie actually touching it. So I'm pretty sure this is either Paimon or the cult using their powers in an attempt to manipulate the situation. Annie wasn't going to call, but when the paint spills on the piece of paper and draws her attention once again back on the piece of paper, it prompts Annie to make that phone call. The two would later meet at Joan's place. Right away, there's a major red flag with Joan's welcome mat. Annie remarks about how it looks just like some of the mats that her mother used to make for her, and that is because it is. Ellen had made this mat for Joan as a gift, hinting that Ellen and Joan were very close. Joan also offers Annie some tea, and Annie is put off by something in the tea. A chunk of whatever was in the tea gets on her lips and she wipes it away. This is most likely the same substance that was also used to rub on Ellen's lips earlier in the movie at the funeral. But this must be some sort of ritual to further bind Annie to the cult's will, or to make her more vulnerable to further suggestion. Joan then proceeds to ask Annie about Peter, and Annie admits that they never had a good relationship. An interesting anecdote and another foreshadow is mentioned by Annie, as she recounts a past sleepwalking incident. Annie had found that she had poured paint thinner all over herself and her children, and had even struck the match. She woke up in time to put the match out, but Peter did not believe her that she had not done it purposefully, or that she was sleepwalking. My interpretation of this incident is that it was probably influenced by the cult, as a way to sow more discord between the children and their mother. After Charlie was born, Ellen moved into the house and cared for Charlie, so she would have been in the house at the time. I think Ellen may have performed a ritual and compelled Annie to sleepwalk. This incident really did cause a lot of mistrust amongst the family members and worked to divide them up. The family further deteriorates with Annie behaving more erratically and disturbed. Annie chooses to recreate the scene of Charlie's decapitation, predictably upsetting Steve, who is concerned about Peter seeing it. Annie justifies it as a way to objectively recreate the scene, and that this wasn't even about Peter. While she may be trying to cope, this piece of art she is creating is disturbing and upsetting. At dinner, things escalate quickly with Annie losing her temper with Peter, blaming him for Charlie's death, and how he could not admit to what he had done. Peter retaliates that Charlie would have not been with him if Annie had not made them go with him that night. Steve interjects to end the fight, and Annie storms off. The next day, Annie runs into Joan while picking up more art supplies, no doubt by Joan's design. Joan is seen in a euphoric mood and delightfully tells Annie that she has found a way to reconnect with her dead grandson. Joan details how she met up with a group of people as part of an event, a call to skeptics to attend a seance. Something interesting to note here is that this very event that Joan says she attended is earlier referenced in the movie. A flyer was shoved into the family's door, but Annie never saw it or just ignored it. I'm pretty sure this event was put on by the cult to lure Annie to the event, but since Annie did not attend, Joan had to make alterations to the cult's plan. Joan manages to convince Annie to participate in a private seance, where Joan does seem to summon her grandson, who makes a connection. As I mentioned earlier, I think this scene right here is why I believe Joan and the other cult members orchestrated the deaths of Joan's own son and grandson. She needed this seance to convince Annie to believe in the process. Joan's grandson answering by moving the glass and writing on the board means that there's a spirit there. If the grandson was not real and was just a made-up story, what spirit is responding to this summoning? I think Joan willingly sacrificed her grandson in pursuit of the cult's final goal. This is not really surprising since Ellen was more than willing to sacrifice her entire family in the same pursuit. Annie understandably is shaken by the seance. She asks for it to stop and to leave. As she's trying to leave the apartment, Joan uses Annie's vulnerability to give instructions and plants the thought of Annie performing the seance on her own. She even gives Annie a candle to perform the ritual, and a step-by-step instructional. As Annie is driving away, she hears a loud clicking sound, the same sound that Charlie used to do, a clear sign that King Paimon is very much close by. That night, Annie has a very disturbing dream. In the dream, she is awake. She finds a trail of ants that leads to Peter's room. In his bed, a dead Peter is being devoured by ants. She stares in shock and horror, only for Peter to break her out of her trance by asking her what she was doing. Annie is seemingly broken out of her dream. Peter is seemingly fine. A distressed Peter asks why she is scared of him, to which Annie catches herself responding that she never wanted to be his mother. She even confesses to trying to terminate the pregnancy, but failing. A distraught Peter asks why she tried to kill him. Annie tries to reassure Peter that she loves him, and that she is glad that her attempts to terminate him failed. They soon are drenched in what appears to be paint thinner, and both Annie and Peter goes up in flames. Annie now fully wakes from the dream. This dream seems to be a representation of Annie's inner secret thoughts and desires, her longing to be rid of Peter, but also her conflicting fear of losing him. It is clear that she is resentful of becoming a mother, but also has great love for her children. This dream or vision or whatever it was might have also been sent by the cult, a further push to break Annie's sanity. Whatever it is, the dream convinces Annie to perform the seance, and she summons Charlie, using the steps that Joan had given her. Her desperation and vulnerable mental state left her completely vulnerable to Joan's suggestion. The summoning proves successful, and an ecstatic Annie wakes Peter and Steve and gets them to join her in the ritual. Initially, Steve and Peter are skeptical, but Peter soon feels something change in the air, commenting that it feels like the air is flexing. Suddenly, the cup moves. Steve becomes alarmed, and Peter begins to have what appears to be a panic attack. The family begins to argue, with Steve wanting to put a stop to the seance and Annie pushing to continue. As the tension grows, glass breaks in the corner, and the candle flame shoots up violently. Paimon/Charlie seems to enter Annie, with Annie's mouth open wide like she's taking a deep breath. Then Annie begins to speak with what appears to be Charlie's voice. Charlie is distressed and begins to panic, which in turn scares Peter as well. Steve goes to the kitchen and retrieves a glass of water and proceeds to splash it onto Annie's face, the water seemingly breaking the trance. Annie is a bit confused and appears to not be aware that anything was amiss. King Paimon seems to now inhabit Annie, though somewhat dormant, with Annie in full control, but that will soon change. After the horrific seance, the last set of mysterious words are seen written onto another wall, Liftosh Pandemonium. So on 3 separate occasions, words of mysterious invocations have been written on the wall, the first being Satani, second Zazas, and the last being 2 words, Liftosh Pandemonium. The words Satani and Zazas seems to have ties to the occult and necromancy, but I can't really find more than that, just that they seem to be involved in parts of some summoning rituals. Liftosh Pandemonium is a little bit more translatable. Liftosh is Hebrew for open up, and Pandemonium seems to be referencing demons or hell. So the words altogether seems to be invocations for the doors of hell to open, or perhaps the doors of the family members in terms of doors of the human soul to let demons in. Weakening the human spirit or subduing the human soul is important in this ritual, as we will see with Peter. After all that has transpired, Peter is emotionally devastated. He's still in shock. He relives moments of that night when Charlie was killed, replaying the horrific moment over and over again. He goes to school and seemingly tries to get back to a routine, but begins to suffer from anxiety attacks as he's hanging out with friends. He feels like he cannot breathe and almost relives Charlie's experience of suffocation. After the seance, he too begins to see the lights, similar to the lights that Charlie had seen. He sees a reflection of himself, except this reflection isn't him. The reflection jeers at him in a mocking way. He also hears the clicking sound that Charlie often made. I think this jeering face is interesting because it goes back to something that Annie had said during their argument. During the dinner argument scene, she talks about an expression on his face, quote, "so full of disdain and resentment, and always so annoyed," end quote. Is this the same face that Annie also sees? Like, is this why Annie seems to have such a bad relationship with her son? Every time she looks at him, is she seeing this jeering face? I'm just speculating, but seeing Peter's reflection mocking him made me think of Annie's tirade about his face. Peter calls his father hysterical about what he's just seen, thinking that he's being haunted by an evil spirit. Annie and Steve get into a heated argument on the phone over Peter's deteriorating mental state. Steve wants to protect Peter, while Annie seems to be in denial over the entire situation. Annie gets a call from the art gallery to check in on the status of her work and her well-being, considering all the family has gone through with Charlie's death. This sends Annie into a rage, and she smashes her diorama and destroys her studio. Steve later walks in to find Annie on the floor in the corner. He also spots a diorama of Peter's room with a figure that seems to represent Peter, except his head is decapitated in his bed. Why did Annie create this diorama? Is she reliving that vision she saw of Peter lying dead in his bed? Annie seems to now be creating dioramas out of her dreams and visions, hinting perhaps that maybe she can no longer distinguish between the real world and her dream world. Asleep in his own room, Peter has another frightening sequence where he hears Charlie's clicking sound. He sees Charlie in the corner of his room, but her head suddenly rolls off and turns into a ball. Suddenly, hands reach out from what seems to be under or behind his bed, and they try to pull on his head, almost like wanting to tear it off. Is this also what Annie saw? where Peter's head gets torn off. That's why she made the diorama of Peter in his bed without his head. Suddenly Annie appears and breaks this sequence. Peter is terrified and Annie tries to reassure him, saying that she can stop whatever is happening. Annie sees Charlie's sketchbook flipping through by itself, with Charlie's drawing on the pages. Pages and pages flip through with what appears to be drawings of Peter. His face is in agony and his eyes are crossed out. Annie decides to burn the book in an attempt to stop Charlie or whatever is happening to her family. But as the book burns, her arm also catches on fire. Annie rescues the sketchbook from the fire and puts out the flame. As a result, the fire on her arm also dissipates. So it appears that the sketchbook is now bound to the family. There would be no way for Annie to destroy the book without also destroying herself. The next day, Annie goes to Joan's apartment, but Joan is not there. But the audience gets to glimpse into Joan's apartment. It appears that Joan has performed a spell on Peter, with sigils of the cult everywhere, and pictures of Peter in a triangle. And Charlie's figurines are also scattered across the table. Annie once again looks to the welcome mat, and begins to put two and two together, realizing that Joan and her mother Ellen must have known one another. At school, Peter sees Joan across the street. She's shouting at him. It seems like she is invoking a spell urging him to leave his body to make way for Paimon, saying, quote, "Peter, I expel you. Zatini, Dagony, a paragon. Peter, get out." While Peter sees Joan as clear as day, and she's shouting at the top of her lungs, no one around Peter seems to hear or see her. This is very reminiscent of the scene where Charlie sees Ellen in the middle of the circle of fire early in the movie, but Annie is unable to see it. Annie returns home to find more connections to Joan and her mother. She finds doormats made for her by her mother and someone named Charles. I presume this is Annie's brother who died at 16, after what I theorize was a failed possession attempt. So Charlie seems to be the direct next attempt, even being named after Charles. On Charles' mat, the symbol of Paimon is clearly seen. Annie also finds a book with the symbol embossed into the cover. Flipping through quickly, there are different diagrams of circles and triangles, and instructions written in a foreign language. I'm no expert, so I looked to the internet to see if I could make sense of any of it. According to some cursory research, this language that appears in the book seems to be closely related to Devanagari, an Indic script used in northern India, but what appears in the book is basically gibberish. A non-diegetic explanation is that the filmmakers used a real language as inspiration for the mysterious texts because it looked foreign to most audiences. However, a diegetic explanation is that this instructional book is further coded using Devanagari, and it perhaps cannot be deciphered by those who are not within the cult. On one of the pages, there is a strange diagram of two figures with what appears to be objects growing out of their heads. The figure on the left appears to be of a man with a beard, with 2 buds and 3 leaves growing out of his head. The figure on the right is a figure that appears more feminine. It is hard to tell, but there is long hair, no beard, and a more slender form. This figure has 3 buds and 2 leaves on it. My speculation is that this is the amount of sacrifice needed for Paimon's return. 2 male buds, 3 female buds, 5 leaves. So 2 males being Charles and Peter, and 3 female sacrifices, Charlie, Ellen, and Annie. 5 total sacrifices. But this is wild speculation on my part, just me trying to grasp at straws, I think. In another book titled Invocations, there's a diagram of King Paimon and a brief description of Paimon. Quote, "King Paimon, god of mischief. When successfully invoked, King Paimon will possess the most vulnerable host, Only when the ritual is complete will King Paimon be locked into his ordained host. Once locked in, a new ritual is required to unlock the possession. The Goetia itself makes no mention of King Paimon's face, while other documentation describe him as having a woman's face, while still referring to him using strictly masculine pronouns. As a result, the sexes of the hosts have varied, and it is documented that King Paimon has become livid and vengeful when offered a female host. For these reasons, it is imperative to remember that King Paimon is a male, thus convectus of a male human body." End quote. With this text, I think this confirms my theory on Charlie being killed before she can develop into a woman, and why Charlie seems more androgynous. Paimon prefers male hosts and will get vengeful when offered female hosts, as we will soon see with Annie to horrific effect. The diagram is also very interesting, depicting Paimon on a camel, holding what appears to be an orb, and a staff that appears to be a human arm. The arm is pointing to a symbol of a North Star of sorts, almost as if to say that Paimon is an oracle and can point people to their truth or destiny. The star is also located on his left, making it his west side. So it's a northwest star. This will become interesting at the end of the movie. On his side, 3 heads are hanging from the camel. I'll get back to this very interesting observation later in the video, but I have a theory on this. On the next page, there's an image of a figure wearing a crown sitting atop a mountain of gold. Below reads, "Riches to the conjurer." This is what is behind the cult's motivation to conjure King Paimon, so he can bestow or guide them to riches. But riches are not just monetary. There's a page from the text that can be seen on the screen, but it is hard to read because most of the text is cropped. But sentences talk about Paimon's advanced knowledge in many different fields. I can make out art, science, astrology, but there are many others that I can't make out. Annie digs further and finds an album of Ellen's old pictures. To her horror, she finds solid proof that Joan and her mother Ellen did in fact know each other. She finds pictures of the cult members together at gatherings and events, and a much younger Joan and Ellen together, showing that not only do they know each other, but they've probably been friends for decades. There are also pictures of Ellen in what appears to be a white dress that resembles a wedding dress, and all the cult members are showering her with gold coins. I think this hints at Ellen's position or elevation to being the leader and matriarch of the cult. She's referred to Queen Lee in a portrait near the end of the movie, so I think this is a ceremony in which she perhaps weds Paimon to become his queen. Her main task as his queen is to find a suitable male host for Paimon to inhabit, so Ellen uses her own family members to make this a reality. We see a picture of Annie and her family, but we also see a picture of a shrine where the cult seems to be venerating the very same picture. At school, Peter sees the unusual light that Charlie also saw, leading him into a classroom. I think this light is the guiding light and is symbolized by the North Star in the drawing of Paimon. The other thing to note about the drawing of Paimon is the human arm Paimon uses as a staff. It is pointing as if to signify that Paimon will lead people towards his will. Meanwhile, at his office, Steve is drafting an email to a coworker. He is very worried about Annie, who he believes is suffering from an episode of psychosis. But as he's finishing up his email, he gets another email that details the grave robbery of Ellen, along with some pictures. The cult members had taken Ellen's body, but Steve begins to think that Annie is the one who did it, as she's suffering from her psychosis. Annie investigates further at home and decides to check the attic. Ominously, there are flies and a foul stench as she opens the attic door. She climbs up the stairs and to her horror finds Ellen's decapitated corpse. Paimon's cult members have taken Ellen's body, decapitated the body, and placed her carcass in the family's attic. The body seems to have putrefied and turned black. Between the corpse's legs, there's a lit candle, meaning cult members have recently been in the attic and is probably still hiding around the house. The dress on the body also has an embroidery symbol of Paimon. The symbol is also painted in what appears to be blood on the ceiling. Back at school, Peter begins to experience a strange and terrifying occurrence. He begins to hear sounds of Charlie's clicking all around him. Suddenly, his arm raises against his will. It is weirdly distorted. He starts to lose all control over his body. His face in particular has now a contorted and pained expression. Peter begins to shake and begins to also make that clicking tongue sound that Charlie did, scaring his fellow classmates and teacher. Peter begins to violently slam his head on the table. The second time seems to snap him back in control. Peter begins to wail in fear. People in the classroom can only back away in fear and confusion. Steve then gets a call from the school notifying him about what had happened to Peter. He goes to retrieve Peter from school and tries to get him home safely. But the emotional turmoil takes its toll on Steve, who's been trying to hold everything together. He loses his composure and cries as he stops at a traffic light. When Steve finally does manage to get Peter home, he is greeted by a hysterical Annie, who is trying to relay all of her findings to him. Annie now knows that she was set up by Joan to perform the seance, and that they are now cursed and bound towards some sort of demonic presence. But Steve, believing that Annie's having a psychotic break, accuses her of stealing her own mother's body. Helpless Annie can only try to break the connection caused by the seance. She believes that if she manages to burn Charlie's sketchbook, it would sever the connection to Charlie and will free the entire family. But with the prior burning attempt, she believes that this will also cause her to burn along with the book. But Annie has made up her mind and is willing to die to save Steve and Peter. Annie professes her love for Steve one last time and urges him to burn the book because she is too scared to do it herself. Prepared to die, Annie waits for Steve to burn the book, but he refuses because he does not want to feed into what he believes is her delusion. Annie, now in a desperate panic, snatches the book and throws it into the fire herself. But instead of Annie burning, it is Steve who begins to burn. He immolates right in front of her. Annie is horrified and stunned, leaving her vulnerable. This is when Paimon takes over her body. Night falls. Very creepy transition shot is seen here. It's very brief, so I missed it on my first go. But in the dark, there's a bunch of naked people standing around the house. The cult members are circling the house, ready to welcome Paimon as the night devolves into further chaos. Peter awakens seeing the eerie red glow of heaters in Charlie's treehouse. Unbeknownst to him, he is not alone. Annie shuffles strangely through the air in the dark behind him. Feeling a bit perturbed, Peter investigates the dark house, and to his horror, he finds the charred remains of his father downstairs. Before he can really process what's going on, possessed Annie can be seen stalking him, watching Peter from the rafters, defying gravity. Peter, sensing someone in the room, slowly turns to find a naked cult member. This appears to be the same cult member that Charlie saw at Ellen's funeral. A thud is heard in the corner. Annie has jumped across the room to land in the shadows of the corner. She lunges out of the shadows to chase after Peter, who flees upstairs. Desperate to get away, Peter quickly climbs up the attic and shuts it behind him, locking it. Annie repeatedly bangs her head violently against the attic door, impossibly so, as she has managed to latch herself to the ceiling somehow, defying gravity itself. Peter is terrified and tries to apologize to her and tries to appease her, begging her to stop. I think Annie is acting super erratic and violent here because Paimon is raging at being summoned into a female body. According to the text that Annie had found, Paimon can become livid and vengeful when offered a female host. I think this is what we're seeing with Annie. Annie's a full-grown woman, so Paimon is enraged. While Paimon has always been framed as a malicious entity, we really never see how scary he can be. We see a lot of scary cult activity, but this really is the first time that we are seeing Paimon truly acting terrifying. When Paimon was in Charlie, Paimon never acted like this before. I think he was placated and accepted Charlie's relatively androgynous young body. Now Paimon is being hosted inside a grown woman's body, and this is when he is acting really demonic and terrifying. He is enraged and trying to desperately find a new, more suitable host, which is why I think Annie is desperately trying to get to Peter. Annie is literally banging her head in frustration and rage, trying to get through the door. Also to note, I think the fake out where Steve burns instead of Annie is intended to shock Annie and to make her very vulnerable. Again, referring to the text about King Paimon that Annie found. Quote, "When successfully invoked, King Paimon will possess the most vulnerable host." The emotional shock is key to getting someone vulnerable enough for Paimon's possession. I think this is what we see with Peter in the classroom as well. While it was a horrific scene with his face and body contorting, Peter was able to struggle and keep Paimon out of his body. He was not yet vulnerable enough for Paimon to enter and fully possess him. With Annie, once she saw her husband in flames, she was almost shocked out of her body, and Paimon was able to enter. Annie's headbanging on the attic door finally begins to subside, and Peter is able to look around the attic, finding lit candles all around the room. An outline of Ellen's body can be seen on the floor, with Peter's picture in the center of the outline. Gouges have been made where his eyes would have been in the picture. Peter tries to calm himself as he begins to panic. He tries to urge himself to wake up, hoping that this was all some horrible dream. A horrific sound directs Peter to look up, where he sees a truly terrifying sight. Annie is now levitating in the air in the attic. She is glaring at Peter as she saws through her own neck with a piano wire. I do love the little bit of foreshadowing with the piano wire because the piano downstairs has been seen in multiple shots throughout the movie. The piano was also seen destroyed as Peter was investigating the house. Possessed Annie must have broken the piano to retrieve the piano wires. Annie begins to saw at a faster rate. Peter can only stare in horror as his mother decapitates herself. Peter is startled by a clicking sound, and he turns his head to find that he and possessed Annie are not the only ones in the attic. The attic is full of naked cult members. One gleefully waves at him out of the shadows. Peter shouts in fear and is so scared he runs through the window. He falls to the first floor and onto the garden bed below. As he lies still, sounds of Annie's sawing continues. Then there is a thudding sound of her head rolling on the ground. The strange light returns and hovers over Peter's back and seemingly disperses into him. After which Peter regains consciousness, only now he is no longer Peter. Paimon has taken control of his body. Paimon, sees Annie's decapitating corpse floating into the treehouse. Intrigued, Paimon follows the body up the ladder, and sadly we do see a quick shot of the family dog dead in the yard. So not even the poor dog was spared. Awaiting Paimon in the treehouse are his devoted followers, kneeling in prostration. They seem to be awaiting him, but also worshipping a horrific effigy on the other side of the treehouse. The body of this effigy seems to be a posable mannequin, with the symbol of Paimon on the chest. The left hand is gesturing down with 3 fingers extended, the thumb, the index finger, and the middle finger, while the pinky finger and the ring finger are closed. This hand pose is reminiscent of those that can be seen in some old religious Christian and Jewish artworks. The hand in this pose is called the Hand of God, which in the past was a way to represent God's will or the Word of God, since depictions of God were sacrilege. So God's will was usually depicted in some artworks as a hand in this pose. In other depictions, the hand gesture can also be a signal of a blessing, or for figures for whom acts as a voice of God, or a speaker. The effigy is also holding the strange scepter that was seen in the depiction of King Paimon in Ellen's book. The scepter is unique in design. It is fashioned in the form of an arm. The hand is in a pointing gesture, using the index finger to point to a direction. Now, interestingly, there is a real scepter called the Hand of Justice, which might be the inspiration behind Paimon's scepter seen in the movie. But the real Hand of Justice scepter is actually doing the Hand of God gesture. My interpretation is that Paimon is depicted in this pose as a way to mock God, communicating that Paimon is the hand of his own god. As one of the kings of hell, I presume that Paimon's god is the devil. The most jarring thing of this effigy, of course, is the head, which is Charlie's decapitated, rotting head. The skin has turned gray from putrefaction, and while the left eye remains closed, the right seems to be open, and something golden has been lodged into the eye socket. Maybe a gold coin or a gold glass eye of some sort. Metal rods have also been jammed into the head to mimic Christian iconography of the halo, which signifies sainthood or divinity. On top of Charlie's head sits a crown. The crown is unadorned, but the shape seems to be inspired by mural crowns, which evokes the feeling of antiquity. I think this really enforces the idea that Paimon is an ancient being of great power. Next to the effigy is a large bird cage with a live bird inside. My interpretation is that this is meant to symbolize how Peter's soul is now caged and locked away, with Paimon in full control of Peter's body. Paimon looks upon the effigy with mild interest. He then looks down to see bodies of the recently deceased and beheaded Annie, and the decomposing rotted corpse of Ellen at the foot of the effigy. Both bodies are posed in prostration as if in worship of the effigy. So 3 females have been sacrificed to be able to bring about this summoning. I mentioned earlier in the video where I think this was foreshadowed by that drawing of Paimon in Ellen's book. In that drawing, we see 3 heads, Annie, Ellen, and Charlie, all decapitated, so the connection is clear. Paimon turns to face his followers. In the corner, he sees Ellen's framed picture with the words Queen Lee, as a cult member with long hair removes the crown from the effigy and places it on Paimon's head. The headless bodies of Ellen and Annie are inexplicably turned towards Paimon. This has really interesting implications, as the body seems to have magically turned to face him by themselves. Are they moving on their own? Is Paimon moving them? Is Annie, Charlie, and Ellen still trapped in their own bodies? Is that how they're moving them? What does this mean? Are their souls now enslaved by the cult and by Paimon too? I don't have answers, but I find the implications truly horrific. A small detail I did notice is that Annie's body is still twitching. As Paimon looks at the bodies, Joan's voice can be heard. So I believe it was Joan who was the one who placed the crown on his head. She then tells him, quote, "It's all right, Charlie. You're all right now. You are Paimon, one of the 8 kings of hell. We have looked to the northwest and called you in. We've corrected your first female body and give you now this healthy male host. We reject the Trinity and pray devoutly to you, great Paimon. Give us your knowledge of all secret things. Bring us honor, wealth, and good familiars. Bind all men to our will as we bound ourselves from now and ever to yours. Hail Paimon." The other cult members pick up the chant and hail Paimon as their new king. So what Joan says is incredibly insightful, and basically offers a great summary of why the cult did what they did. The first line goes, quote, "It's all right, Charlie. You're all right now. You are Paimon, one of the 8 kings of hell." I find this interesting that Joan calls Paimon Charlie. I think this confirms that Paimon has been in control of Charlie's body since Charlie was a baby. Joan also has to reassure Paimon of his identity, almost like she's reminding him of who he is as one of the 8 kings of hell. Which explains why Charlie was acting like a relatively normal teenager. Don't get me wrong, Charlie was very odd, but for someone who was possessed by one of the 8 kings of hell, Charlie was pretty harmless. Even when Paimon first possessed Annie's body after Charlie's death, Paimon was confused and was asking for their mother. The next line is, quote, "We have looked to the northwest and called you in," end quote. Joan mentions looking towards the northwest. I think this is in reference to the image of Paimon again, where the North Star is seen on the west side. The next line is, quote, "We've corrected your first female body and give you now this healthy male host." I think this is referencing how Charlie was the first female host, and to correct that, the cult had to devise a convoluted plan to kill Charlie. They had to perform a ritual to unlock Charlie's possession and move Paimon into Annie, then into Peter. The next line reads, quote, "We reject the Trinity and pray devoutly to you, great Paimon. Give us your knowledge of all secret things. Bring honor, wealth, and good familiars. Bind all men to our will as we bound ourselves from now and ever to yours." These last lines lay out the cult's goal in full. The cult rejects the Trinity, which is a central Christian doctrine that God exists in 3 divine persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The cult rejects the Trinity, which is ultimately rejecting the Christian God, and chooses instead Paimon. In doing so, there seems to be a horrific version of the cult's own Trinity, with the sacrifices and decapitation of 3 of the female family members, Ellen, Annie, and Charlie, and the 3 hosts for Paimon, Charlie, Annie, and now Peter. They hope Paimon will bestow them with knowledge of all secret things, bring honor, wealth, and good familiars. Familiars are usually associated with witchcraft. They are supernatural entities that attend or assist the witch in their endeavors. They're usually described as taking animal forms and are subservient to the witch or the summoner. The cult also wants to bind all men to their will, as they have bound their will to Paimon's. So they want the ability to control humanity. From some of the spells and rituals that we've seen them perform during the story, it seems like this request is not so far-fetched. So with Paimon summoned into a suitable male host and the cult's ultimate goal accomplished, what does this mean for the world? One of the last lingering shots is of Paimon's face. He looks rather surprised and astonished by Joan's revelations. The movie ends with a shot of Paimon and the cult members in the treehouse, framed in darkness. The shot is reminiscent of Annie's miniatures, which usually evokes themes of powerlessness of the subject. Throughout the movie, the miniatures are Annie's way of creating art to deal with trauma, but it also symbolized how Annie's entire life was being manipulated and controlled by her mother and later on the cult. This last shot of Paimon makes him seem so small and lost, almost like now he too is being controlled by others. Is Paimon now trapped by the whims and follies of the cult that venerates him? Did Paimon even want to be summoned into a human host? The credits roll and music begins to play, a rather beautiful but bittersweet song by Joni Mitchell called Both Sides Now. The lyrics cherish and laments on how things change as one grows older. Both sides now refers to one's ability to see things from both sides, one of youthful optimism and the other side of pragmatic sensibility. The song seems to be celebrating the dichotomy, perhaps an ode to growing up and coming of age. My interpretation is that this song was chosen for Paimon, as he had a youthful upbringing within Charlie and now must grow up, so to speak, as he lives within Peter. Or the music was perhaps chosen to highlight the movie's theme that things are not quite what they seem. This seemingly normal house with this normal family was the backdrop to a horrific cult and their terrifying practice. The entire family ended up with a horrific fate, even the dog. Yet to the cult members, this was a wonderful and glorious victory. Their king has returned, and their decades of hard work has finally paid off. But is that true? Once again, the last shot ends rather ambiguous. The movie starts with Peter framed like he is one of his mother's miniatures, and the movie also ends with Peter framed the same way. The framing device hints that Peter, now Paimon, may not be in control. The song seems to hint that perhaps the cult too will have to learn that Paimon may not prove to be what they expected. They might have seen one side of him, and now they're about to see both sides of him. I hope you have enjoyed my summary, thoughts, and observations of the movie Hereditary. If you have enjoyed the video, please leave a like and leave a comment down below. I read every comment, and you all have always provided such wonderful insights and thoughts of your own. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you do return for my next video.